welcome to NewsClick. Over the last few days, there's been quite a bit of consternation amongst public health activists in India, with media reports indicating that the Modi government has privately assured the United States that it will not grant any compulsory licenses to pharmaceutical products. To discuss the implications of this assurance and the impact this may have on the public health sector in India, we're joined by Dr. Amit Sengupta from the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan. Thanks for being here, Amit. Now, let's start with the main issue at hand, that of the government giving this assurance to the US that it will not issue any more compulsory licenses. What are the specific implications of this assurance on public health in India, and do we as a country get anything at all out of this deal that the government seems to have struck?
Well, because this is a private assurance, so you will not find anything in government documents which say this. But the fact that this was given as a private assurance speaks volumes of the clandestine manner in which the present government has been trying to undermine the basic tenets of the Indian Patents Act. If you really look at the discussions that took place before the Indian Patents Act was amended in 2005, one of the major concerns that was sought to be addressed was that how do you continue to have a situation where Indian generic industry remains the lifeline of poor patients in India and across the world. And the background to this, of course, is that for the last 30 years, the Indian generic industry was able to make generic equivalents of drugs that were patented globally and be able to sell them at something like 5% or less of the global costs. And one of the key instruments that was embedded in the Indian Patents Act was the compulsory licensing provisions.
So you mean this was a historically present provision? It's always been there in the Patents Act?
Well, compulsory licensing, since the 1970 Patent Act came into force, it wasn't really of import because we did not require a compulsory license in India till 2005 because we did not recognize product patents. So the compulsory licensing provisions were brought back into Indian Patent Act when we agreed to a product patent regime as a fallback option of providing the opportunity for Indian generic companies to continue to manufacture drugs that are patented, so new drugs that are patented globally. So it lay at the heart of the Indian Patent Act in terms of its attempt to safeguard public health and to break the monopoly of multinational corporations who would otherwise be able to charge astronomical prices for drugs because there was no competition in the market.
Now, could you briefly explain the need for a compulsory licensing provision in a Patents Act? I mean, you've spoken about the fact that you need to break up the monopoly that foreign MNCs might have, but doesn't this defeat the very purpose of a patent, which is to give a statutory right which confers a monopoly on the inventor, primarily in order to enable the inventor to recoup the costs of research and development or inventing the product?
So there are two parts to this. One is that when you confer a patent to any manufacturer or any company, there are rights as well as obligations. It's not a right that is not circumvented by obligations. Okay. Now the obligations are that, and the Indian Patent Act actually lays it down very clearly. There are several obligations related to the fact that the medicine should be available. The medicine should be accessible and affordable. That commercial exploitation of the patent should take place within the country. So there are health implications as well as commercial implications of how a patent is worked, right? That's one part of it. Now, the argument that has always been used by Big Pharma is that a 20-year monopoly is necessary to recoup the cost of discovering new drugs. Now, there is a whole range of contrary evidence which shows, one, that much of the research that pharmaceutical companies actually utilized to discover new drugs is done through public funding. And I am not talking about India, I am talking about the United States, where many of the new drugs are actually being developed, or Europe. So there is a huge component of public funding that goes in, which pharmaceutical companies never actually acknowledge. One. Second, they also overestimate the cost of development of a drug. And because their books are so opaque and not open for scrutiny, it is impossible to actually come to a correct figure of how much it costs in terms of investment to discover a new
And of
drug.
course, I doubt it's linear.
And it's not linear. And evidence does show that when you have what is called a blockbuster drug, it recoups its cost within weeks or months. So you don't require the 20-year monopoly for the originator company to recoup its cost. The first blockbuster, which is Zintac, GlaxoSmithKline, it was believed that within 3 to 6 months, it had made much more than what the company claimed it had put into discovering that drug. You have Sofosbuvir, the hepatitis C drug, which is gained infamy for being called the $1,000 pill. Now, Sofosbuvir within 3 months had become the top selling drug in the globe, and in less than a year had recouped that $11 billion which Gilead Sciences is believed to have paid to get the rights of the drug from a smaller drug company. So, this is the kind of super profits that pharmaceutical companies make. You can look at it through indirect evidence itself. If you look at Forbes 500, the top companies, in terms of revenues, pharmaceutical companies come way down. They are nowhere in the top 100, right? But if you look at the profits, they come way up. They are the most profitable companies in the world. So clearly, they are making profits that are out of sync with what they are delivering. I mean, the only other company which comes anywhere near it, other two, are the tobacco companies and the beverage companies. So that's the kind of profits that they make, and which makes us say that a monopoly period of 20 years is not warranted.
So, do you believe that there's any merit in the statement that the compulsory licensing provisions are not, or the way they are drafted in the Indian Act, are not TRIPS compliant? And if you believe that they are actually TRIPS compliant, or even if they aren't, should the US actually have taken India to the WTO if they had an issue with the way they implemented
there are no doubts about this. The Indian law is entirely TRIPS compliant. There has been no challenge in the TRIPS Council against the Indian law. Everybody acknowledges that the compulsory licensing provisions as well are compliant with the provisions of TRIPS, because TRIPS actually, TRIPS is not a one-size-fits-all agreement, fortunately. It gives a lot of flexibility to countries. It just gives you a framework. Then it is up to countries to determine, for example, in compulsory licensing, what are the grounds on which you can issue a compulsory license. And the Indian law has one of the broadest grounds available in any patent act for issuance of compulsory license. So that's really the point, that the legislative intent of the Indian Patent Act is very clear. When the Parliament debated and passed the Indian Patent Act, the intent was to make it easy to issue a compulsory license, because Parliament at that time was cognizant that compulsory license is one of the few ways in which you can mitigate the impact of the TRIPS agreement. So it's unfortunate that today the government of the day turns back and almost says something that is entirely contrary to the legislative intent of the 2005 Patent Act.
Now, this is something you just alluded to, but is compulsory licensing the only way in which cheaper drugs can be made available? Is the government actually then going to explore options such as maybe pricing controls to look at how it can compensate?
Well, price controls have been mooted, have been tried in different places. Price controls work to an extent depending on what kind of pricing controls you put in place. And now we are talking about patented drugs, right? Now, the big problem with patented drugs is that finally the lever is with the manufacturer, is with the originator company. If they choose, and whatever price you set in the country, if they don't like that price, they will not market the drug in your country. So, there is nothing that you can do to force a company to sell a drug based on a price that you have set for that drug, if they have a monopoly on it. So, when you have a monopoly, the only feasible way in which you can, on a sustained basis, ensure the availability of a drug in affordable prices is by breaking that monopoly, and compulsory license is about breaking the monopoly, because it allows other companies to manufacture and sell the drug.
So now India has so far issued only one compulsory license. So does this private assurance by the Modi government actually change anything on the ground? I mean, is there a case for greater use of this provision generally, and if so, why hasn't it been used previously?
So probably we should put it in the following way, that the present government is saying clearly now what the past governments were not saying, but perhaps still doing, which is that the past governments ever since 2005, the Indian government has been reluctant to issue a compulsory license, and it does not require rocket science to understand why it was reluctant. It was entirely due to pressure from the United States, especially, whose companies' interests in the US government has at heart, and that is why you have just one compulsory license. I mean, even Zimbabwe, Zambia, Eritrea, Ghana, they have done better than India in issuing compulsory license. And here you have the most developed pharmaceutical industry in the developing world, and you have just issued one compulsory license. But the danger is that we are seeing a shift that seems to now be something that you cannot reverse. But by the kind of shift that the present government has moved towards, it seems an irreversible move, because it has also to be seen with other attendant measures that the government has taken. There is this, there is the new IP, draft IP policy, which, for example, waxes eloquent on how intellectual property is something that should be utilized by companies. You will be incentivized to utilize intellectual property. There is no word in that about the negative effects of higher intellectual property protection, higher levels of IP protection, what it would mean for in the Indian research system, what it would mean for public health. So you also have that happening on one hand. You have, since Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States, you have now a permanent mechanism between the United States and India, which is supposed to discuss IP issues. Now remember that for almost 3 decades, India has been on the watch list of the USTR under the 301 provision. Every year, India is singled out, saying its IP laws are contrary to US interests, right? So obviously, US interests and Indian interests are very different when you talk about IP law, but when you put in place a permanent mechanism, you are already starting to give in, and you are already signaling that you are willing to accommodate US business interests, and you are not really paying attention to what it would do to public health. And this is sort of one more link in the chain of events that has unfolded, especially in the last 2 years, in India moving much closer to the US and basically giving up on a public health safeguard that could have mitigated.
So, do you think that this is sort of the slippery slope, that there's no stopping us now from looking to align our patenting regimes with those in the West, despite the fact that we clearly have different reasons for having these provisions in our Patents Act? And can anything be done to challenge this? Because, as you said, it's not on paper, so it's not even in that sense subject to judicial review or any such action. So, what can actually be done? Is there anything?
Well, actually, the Indian government's stated position on intellectual property was out of sync with the neoliberal economic regime in place. So, to be charitable to the present government, one can say that it has now aligned its IP policy to the neoliberal regime that is in place. So, fundamentally, if you are going to talk about reversing the situation, you have to also talk about reversing the consensus among the big political parties in India about the neoliberal regime that exists in India.
No, but couldn't it be argued that if you have patent systems that are aligned to those in the West, that you will actually encourage more foreign companies to come into India, possibly produce the drugs here, which is one aspect of it, and secondly, market a greater number of drugs to Indians, so therefore you'll have more choice?
Well, I don't think there is any evidence that shows that companies ever come bringing in technology and actually make available at affordable prices medicines. So, the point is not that they will bring in more medicines, the point is not that you will have more choice. The point is that whether you can actually, even when those medicines are available, you can afford them. Now, if you look at the data from the last 2 to 3 years on a range of new products that are now being introduced in the global market and also to a limited extent in the Indian market, the cost of therapy is in the range of 2 to 3 lakh rupees per month. It's an impossible kind of cost for 99.9% of Indian. So it doesn't help if corporations come to India with their goodies, if those goodies are not going to be something that people in India can afford.
Well, there's another example of this government's nationalism for you. And that's all the time we have on NewsClick today. Do join us again for another episode.